Hey, tonight we're taking a journey back in time. Not just a few centuries or even millennia, but 10 million years into Earth's ancient past. A world so alien, so dramatically different from today, that you might not even recognize it as the same planet. You probably think you know what shaped human evolution. Maybe you've heard about Lucy, our famous ancestor, or perhaps you imagine early hominids wandering African savannas. But the real story, the one that actually determined whether our lineage would survive or vanish forever, begins much earlier. And it's not what you think. If you're enjoying these deep dives into our planet's hidden history, I'd really appreciate a quick like or even a subscribe. It helps more than you know. I'm always curious where you all are tuning in from, so drop a comment with your location and what time it is there. Love seeing our global community connect through these ancient stories. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. We're going back 10 million years to witness the climatic upheavals that would determine whether humanity would ever exist at all. Picture this. You've just been transported to Earth 10 million years ago during what geologists call the late Miocene epoch. The first thing that hits you isn't the sight or sound, it's the air itself. Thick, humid, almost tropical even in regions that today are bone-dry deserts. You're breathing atmosphere with carbon dioxide levels nearly triple what they are now. The greenhouse effect is in full swing, and our planet is a fundamentally different world. Where you'd expect to see the Sahara Desert stretching endlessly, there are lush woodlands and meandering rivers. The Mediterranean isn't a sea at all, but a massive salt flat baking under an intense sun, having dried up completely in an event so catastrophic that geologists named it the Messinian salinity crisis. The Arctic Ocean, that frozen wasteland at the top of our world, is actually warm enough for crocodiles to thrive. Yes, crocodiles in the Arctic. But here's what's truly mind-bending. The ancestors of every human being who has ever lived are scattered across this alien landscape as small, ape-like creatures clinging to forest canopies that stretch from Spain to China in an unbroken green belt. They have no idea that their world is about to change so dramatically that it will force them down an evolutionary path leading directly to you sitting here right now, 10 million years later. The climate of the late Miocene was what scientists call a hothouse world. Global temperatures averaged about 8 to 10 degrees Celsius warmer than today. That might not sound like much, but it's the difference between a world of endless forests and the ice age cycles that would eventually sculpt our species. Ocean currents flowed in patterns completely different from today's, carrying warm tropical waters to polar regions and keeping the entire planet in a state of perpetual summer. Antarctica, that frozen continent we know today, supported temperate forests. Beech trees grew where today only ice and rock exist. The ice sheets we associate with polar regions were either completely absent or confined to small highland areas. Sea levels stood roughly 40 meters higher than today, flooding vast areas that are now dry land and creating inland seas where today you'd find major cities. This was Earth's last great greenhouse period, and it was ending. The forces that would bring it crashing down were already in motion, grinding away beneath the surface, building toward a climatic revolution that would reshape not just the planet's weather patterns, but the very trajectory of life itself. Deep beneath the Earth's surface, tectonic forces were reshaping entire continents. The Himalayas were still rising, thrust upward by the relentless collision between the Indian and Eurasian plates. But this wasn't just mountain building for its own sake. These massive peaks were creating a barrier that would fundamentally alter global wind patterns and ocean circulation. As the Himalayas rose higher, they began blocking moisture-laden monsoon winds from reaching Central Asia. Rainfall patterns that had remained stable for millions of years started shifting. The lush forests of what is now Mongolia and western China began experiencing longer dry seasons. Trees that had dominated these landscapes for geological ages found themselves struggling to survive. At the same time, The Isthmus of Panama was slowly emerging from the ocean, a land bridge that would eventually connect North and South America. This doesn't sound earth-shattering, but it was literally reshaping global ocean circulation. Warm equatorial waters that had previously flowed freely between the Atlantic and Pacific were being gradually constricted, forcing currents to find new paths and disrupting thermal patterns that had regulated global climate for millions of years. The Antarctic Circumpolar Current, that massive ring of water flowing around the southern continent, was intensifying. This current acts like a thermal barrier, isolating Antarctica from warmer waters to the north. As it strengthened, it began trapping cold water around the continent, setting the stage for ice sheet formation that would lock up vast amounts of water and dramatically lower global sea levels. But perhaps the most crucial change was happening in the Atlantic. The gradual closure of tropical seaways was redirecting warm water northward, creating the early stages of what would become the Gulf Stream. This sounds beneficial, warming the North Atlantic, but it had a paradoxical effect. By carrying warm, salty water north where it cooled and sank, it was creating a massive conveyor belt of ocean circulation that would eventually trigger the planet's descent into ice age cycles. These geological forces were like dominoes being set up across the globe. Each change triggered others, creating feedback loops that would amplify small shifts into massive climatic upheavals. And sitting in the forests of Africa and Eurasia, completely unaware of these planetary scale changes, were the ancestors of modern humans. The early apes of the late Miocene lived in a world of abundance, vast forests stretched across continents, providing endless food sources and shelter. These weren't the sparse woodlands we might imagine, but dense, multi-layered canopies teeming with fruit, leaves, and insects. Our ancestors, creatures like Dryopithecus in Europe and various early hominoids in Africa, had adapted perfectly to this arboreal lifestyle. Their hands were designed for gripping branches, their long arms ideal for swinging through trees. Their diet focused on the abundant fruits and vegetation that surrounded them. They lived in small social groups, communicating through calls and gestures, developing the early foundations of what would eventually become human intelligence and cooperation. But this paradise was built on climatic stability. The warm, humid conditions that supported these vast forests depended on atmospheric and oceanic patterns that were already beginning to shift. Carbon dioxide levels, while high by today's standards, were slowly declining as geological processes locked carbon away in rock formations and organic matter. The planetary thermostat was gradually turning down. What our ancestors couldn't know was that they were living through the end of an era. The Miocene climatic optimum, the period of maximum warmth that had created their forest paradise, was drawing to a close. The first subtle signs were already appearing in the fossil record. Plant species that thrived in consistently warm, humid conditions were beginning to disappear from higher latitudes. Cool weather-adapted species were expanding their ranges. In the oceans, microscopic organisms called foraminifera were recording changes in water temperature and chemistry in their shells. These tiny creatures, invisible to our ancestors, but crucial to understanding ancient climates, were documenting the beginning of a cooling trend that would accelerate over the coming millions of years. The stage was set for one of the most dramatic climatic transitions in Earth's history. The greenhouse world that had nurtured early ape evolution was about to give way to an icehouse world of dramatic temperature swings, expanding ice sheets, and radically altered precipitation patterns. This transition wouldn't happen overnight, but when it came, it would force our ancestors to adapt or perish. Some would retreat deeper into the remaining forests, becoming the ancestors of modern chimpanzees and gorillas. Others would be pushed out into increasingly open landscapes, forced to develop new survival strategies that would eventually lead to bipedalism, tool use, and the complex social behaviors that define our species. The late Miocene was ending, and with it, the stable climatic conditions that had allowed early apes to flourish in their arboreal paradise. What came next would test every aspect of their evolutionary toolkit and ultimately determine which lineages would survive to give rise to modern humans. The cooling began subtly, almost imperceptibly. Average global temperatures dropped by just a degree or two over hundreds of thousands of years. To our ancestors swinging through the forest canopies, these changes would have been invisible. A slightly shorter growing season here, a minor shift in rainfall patterns there. Nothing dramatic enough to force immediate adaptation, but climate systems are incredibly sensitive to small changes. That 1 or 2 degree temperature drop triggered a cascade of environmental shifts that would reshape entire continents. Ice began accumulating in Antarctica more rapidly, locking up water and lowering global sea levels. This exposed new land bridges while isolating previously connected regions, fragmenting habitats and forcing species into smaller, more isolated populations. The first major casualty was the forest belt that had stretched across Eurasia. As temperatures cooled and precipitation patterns shifted, this green highway that had allowed early apes to spread from Africa to Europe began breaking apart. Forests retreated to refugia in protected valleys and coastal areas, leaving vast expanses of grassland, and eventually steppe in their wake. In Africa, the changes were equally dramatic, but took different forms. The continent's position straddling the equator meant it was less affected by the initial cooling, but changes in global circulation patterns altered rainfall distribution across the region. Some areas became wetter, supporting dense forests. Others grew increasingly arid, with woodlands giving way to savannas and eventually grasslands. This fragmentation created what evolutionary biologists call allopatric speciation, the formation of new species when populations become geographically isolated. Early ape populations that had once been part of continuous forest communities found themselves cut off from their relatives, forced to adapt to new local conditions or face extinction. The isolation wasn't just geographical, it was evolutionary. As forest corridors disappeared, genetic exchange between populations slowed to a trickle, then stopped entirely. Each isolated group faced unique environmental pressures, and natural selection began sculpting them in different directions. In the dense forests that remained in equatorial Africa, some populations doubled down on their arboreal lifestyle. They developed longer arms, stronger grips, and more specialized digestive systems for processing leaves and bark when fruit became scarce. These lineages would eventually give rise to modern gorillas and chimpanzees, masters of the canopy who chose to perfect their forest existence rather than venture into the unknown. But other populations found themselves in a far more precarious situation. They occupied the transition zones, the forest edges where trees gave way to increasingly open grasslands. As their woodland refuges continued shrinking, these early apes faced a choice that would echo through millions of years of evolution. Retreat deeper into the remaining forests and compete with already established populations, or venture out into the alien landscape of the emerging savannas. Those who chose the grasslands faced challenges that would have seemed insurmountable. The open landscape offered little protection from predators. Food sources were scattered and seasonal. Water became a precious resource requiring long, dangerous journeys to obtain. The specialized anatomy that had served them so well in the trees, those long arms and curved fingers perfect for swinging through branches, suddenly became liabilities in a world where survival might depend on covering long distances on the ground. Yet this apparent disadvantage contained the seeds of humanity's greatest evolutionary breakthrough, walking upright on 2 legs. Initially perhaps just a way to see over tall grass or carry precious resources across open terrain, freed the hands for entirely new purposes. What had once been tools for gripping branches could now manipulate objects, construct simple tools, and eventually reshape the world itself. The cooling trend that had begun so subtly was now accelerating. By 8 million years ago, global temperatures had dropped significantly from their late Miocene peak. Ice sheets were expanding in Antarctica, And for the first time in millions of years, permanent ice began forming in the Arctic as well. The planet was entering what geologists call the late Miocene cooling event, a climatic shift that would set the stage for the Ice Age cycles that would dominate the next several million years. This cooling wasn't uniform across the globe. Some regions experienced dramatic temperature drops, while others saw relatively modest changes. But everywhere, the effects were profound. Ocean currents shifted, weather patterns reorganized, and ecosystems that had remained stable for geological ages suddenly found themselves in flux. In Africa, the cooling manifested primarily as changes in rainfall patterns. The monsoon systems that had brought regular precipitation to much of the continent began weakening and becoming more erratic. Wet seasons grew shorter and less reliable. Dry seasons extended, sometimes lasting for years at a time. Rivers that had flowed year-round became seasonal streams, and many disappeared entirely. These hydrological changes struck at the heart of forest ecosystems. Trees that had evolved under conditions of reliable moisture found themselves stressed by extended droughts. Many species simply couldn't adapt quickly enough. Forest composition began changing as drought-tolerant species replaced those adapted to consistent rainfall. The dense multi-layered canopies that had characterized late Miocene forests gave way to more open woodlands with scattered trees and expanding grasslands. Our ancestors living in these transitional environments witnessed changes that would have seemed apocalyptic. Within a single lifetime, familiar landscapes transformed beyond recognition. Streams dried up, forcing longer and more dangerous journeys to find water. Favorite food trees died off, replaced by species that produced different fruits or none at all. Predator populations shifted as some species thrived in the new conditions while others declined. But climate change also created opportunities for those flexible enough to exploit them. The expanding grasslands, while initially hostile to forest-adapted apes, supported vast herds of grazing animals. These herbivores, in turn, attracted predators and scavengers, creating new ecological niches for species capable of adapting to them. Some early hominids began incorporating meat into their diets, initially perhaps just scavenging from predator kills, but eventually developing the tools and techniques for active hunting. This dietary shift had profound implications for brain development, as the high energy content of meat could support the metabolic demands of larger, more complex brains. The social implications were equally significant. Hunting and scavenging in open environments required coordination and communication far more sophisticated than anything needed for solitary fruit gathering in trees. Groups that could work together effectively had enormous advantages over those that couldn't. This pressure for cooperation and communication may have been one of the crucial drivers in the development of early language and the complex social behaviors that would eventually distinguish humans from all other species. As the late Miocene gave way to the Pliocene epoch around 5 million years ago, the climatic trends that had begun so subtly were now dominating global systems. The world had cooled by several degrees. Ice sheets covered significant portions of Antarctica, and the first glaciers were beginning to form in mountain ranges across the northern hemisphere. But perhaps the most significant change was the establishment of a new climatic rhythm. Instead of the stable greenhouse conditions that had characterized most of the Miocene, Earth's climate was becoming increasingly variable. Warm periods alternated with cool phases, wet cycles gave way to droughts, and ecosystems that had remained static for millions of years now faced constant pressure to adapt or disappear. This new climatic instability would become the crucible in which human intelligence was forged. Species that could respond quickly to changing conditions, that could modify their behavior and even their environment to survive new challenges, had enormous advantages over those locked into rigid ecological niches. The stage was now set for the next phase of human evolution. The stable forest paradise of the late Miocene was gone forever, replaced by a world of constant change and challenge. In this new environment, the lineages that would eventually give rise to modern humans would face tests that would push the boundaries of what was possible for any species. Flexibility would become more important than specialization. Intelligence would prove more valuable than raw physical strength. And the ability to work together, to share knowledge and coordinate activities across large groups, would become the ultimate survival tool in a world where the only constant was change itself. The great climatic transition was far from over. The cooling that had begun in the late Miocene would continue and accelerate, eventually giving rise to the dramatic ice age cycles of the Pleistocene. But already, in these early stages of planetary cooling, the fundamental pressures that would shape human evolution were taking hold. Our ancestors had been forced out of their arboreal paradise into a world of uncertainty and challenge. Some would retreat to the safety of remaining forests, becoming evolutionary dead ends. Others would embrace the challenge, developing new ways of thinking, moving and living that would eventually carry them to every corner of the globe. The 10 million year journey from tree-dwelling apes to spacefaring humans had begun, driven not by any grand design or inevitable progression, but by the relentless pressure of a changing climate that demanded adaptation or extinction. In the vast scope of geological time, the transformation would seem almost instantaneous. But for the individuals living through it, each generation faced choices that would echo through millions of years of evolutionary history. The transformation wasn't just happening on land. Beneath the waves, equally dramatic changes were reshaping marine ecosystems in ways that would ripple through the entire food web and ultimately affect our terrestrial ancestors. The oceans of 10 million years ago were vastly different from today's seas, and their transformation played a crucial role in driving the climatic shifts that would forge human evolution. As global temperatures began their long descent from the late Miocene peak, ocean circulation patterns underwent fundamental reorganization. The warm, sluggish currents that had characterized the greenhouse world gave way to more vigorous, complex systems driven by increasing temperature gradients between tropical and polar regions. This wasn't just a matter of water moving faster or slower. It was a complete rewiring of the planet's thermal regulation system. The Drake Passage, that narrow gap between South America and Antarctica, was becoming increasingly important as a choke point for global circulation. As the passage deepened and widened, it allowed the Antarctic circumpolar current to strengthen dramatically. This massive ring of water, flowing continuously around Antarctica, began to isolate the southern continent more effectively than ever before, trapping cold water around its shores and accelerating ice sheet formation. Meanwhile, in the North Atlantic, the early stages of what would become the modern thermohaline circulation were taking shape. Warm, salty water was being carried northward by early versions of the Gulf Stream, where it cooled, became denser, and sank to the ocean floor. This sinking water then flowed southward along the bottom of the Atlantic, eventually mixing with waters from other ocean basins in a process that would help drive global circulation for millions of years to come. But these circulation changes had consequences far beyond the oceans themselves. As cold, nutrient-rich water upwelled in certain regions, while warm water was transported to others, marine productivity patterns shifted dramatically. Areas that had been biological deserts suddenly bloomed with life, while previously productive regions became impoverished. These changes cascaded through marine food webs, affecting everything from microscopic plankton to massive whales. The transformation of marine ecosystems had direct implications for terrestrial environments through its effects on regional climate. Ocean currents don't just transport heat, they also influence precipitation patterns by determining where warm, moisture-laden air masses encounter cooler conditions and release their water as rain. As currents shifted, so did the global distribution of rainfall, creating new deserts in some regions while bringing unexpected abundance to others. In Africa, these marine-driven climate changes were particularly pronounced. The formation of the Benguela Current along the western coast brought cold, nutrient-rich water from the Antarctic region, creating a massive upwelling system that supported incredibly productive marine ecosystems. But this cold water also cooled and dried the adjacent landmasses, contributing to the aridification that was transforming forest landscapes into grasslands and eventually deserts. The eastern coast of Africa experienced different but equally dramatic changes as shifts in Indian Ocean circulation altered monsoon patterns. The reliable seasonal rains that had nourished forest ecosystems for millions of years became increasingly erratic. Some years brought devastating floods, while others saw almost no rainfall at all. This unpredictability placed enormous stress on plant and animal communities that had evolved under more stable conditions. Our early ancestors, still primarily forest dwellers at this point, found their world becoming increasingly fragmented, not just by geographical barriers, but by the growing unpredictability of their environment itself. Food sources that had been reliable for generations might suddenly fail, forcing groups to migrate or find alternative resources. Water sources that had flowed continuously might dry up for years at a time, creating new challenges for survival. But perhaps the most significant oceanic change during this period was the gradual cooling of tropical seas. The warm tropical waters that had supported the vast forest belts of the Middle Miocene were slowly but steadily losing heat to the increasingly efficient global circulation system. This cooling reduced evaporation rates, cutting off the moisture supply that fed the great forest ecosystems of Africa, Europe, and Asia. As tropical sea surface temperatures dropped, the atmospheric rivers that carried moisture inland began to weaken. These aerial highways of water vapor, flowing from ocean to continent, had been the lifeline sustaining interior forests far from coastal areas. As they diminished, vast areas of woodland found themselves in increasingly arid conditions, unable to support the dense canopies that had characterized the earlier Miocene. The timing of these oceanic changes was crucial. They didn't happen all at once, but unfolded over millions of years, creating a slow-motion catastrophe that forced continuous adaptation rather than sudden extinction. Species that might have survived a rapid environmental shift found themselves facing relentless, grinding pressure that eliminated all but the most flexible and adaptable lineages. For the early hominid populations scattered across Africa, these oceanic-driven climate changes created a complex mosaic of environmental pressures. Some groups found themselves in regions where cooling seas brought increased aridity and forest retreat. Others lived in areas where shifting circulation patterns actually brought more moisture, at least temporarily. Still others experienced the most challenging conditions of all, regions where climate became not just harsh, but unpredictably variable from year to year and decade to decade. This variability, more than any single environmental pressure, may have been the key driver of early human evolution. Populations facing consistent drought could adapt through physiological changes, developing more efficient kidneys or better heat tolerance. Those dealing with persistent cold could evolve thicker fur or behavioral adaptations for warmth. But groups facing unpredictable environmental swings needed something far more flexible, the ability to modify their behavior rapidly in response to changing conditions. This pressure for behavioral flexibility favored larger, more complex brains capable of learning, planning, and problem-solving. It selected for social cooperation, as groups that could share knowledge and coordinate responses to environmental challenges had enormous advantages over solitary individuals. Most importantly, it began the long process of cultural evolution, the development of learned behaviors and technologies that could be passed from generation to generation and modified as conditions changed. The marine realm was providing another crucial resource that would become increasingly important as forest environments fragmented. Coastal areas where land met sea offered unique opportunities for early hominids willing to exploit them. Rocky shores provided shellfish and seaweed. Tidal pools contained a rich variety of marine life. Beaches offered both food resources and materials for tool making. Some early hominid populations began making regular forays to coastal environments, initially perhaps just during times when terrestrial resources were scarce. But these coastal visits exposed them to entirely new sets of challenges and opportunities. Walking on beaches required different locomotive skills than navigating forest floors. Extracting shellfish from rocks demanded tool use and problem-solving abilities. Most importantly, coastal environments were often more stable and predictable than the increasingly variable terrestrial landscapes. The nutritional benefits of marine resources were substantial. Shellfish, fish, and seaweed provided high-quality proteins and essential fatty acids that were becoming harder to find as terrestrial ecosystems shifted. Some researchers argue that access to these marine nutrients, particularly the omega-3 fatty acids crucial for brain development, may have been a key factor in the evolution of human intelligence. But exploiting marine resources required new forms of social organization. Tide pools and shellfish beds were finite resources that could be quickly exhausted by overuse. Groups that developed systems for managing these resources sustainably had long-term advantages over those that simply exploited them until they were gone. This may have been one of the earliest drivers of the complex resource management systems that would eventually characterize human societies. The cooling oceans were also affecting global atmospheric composition in ways that would have long-term implications for terrestrial life. Colder water absorbs more carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, slowly reducing the greenhouse effect that had maintained the warm conditions of the Middle Miocene. This created a feedback loop where cooling oceans absorbed more CO2, which caused further cooling, which increased the ocean's capacity to absorb even more carbon dioxide. This gradual reduction in atmospheric CO2 had profound effects on plant life worldwide. Many species that had thrived under high CO2 conditions found themselves at a competitive disadvantage as carbon dioxide levels dropped. This was particularly challenging for trees, which require substantial carbon dioxide for photosynthesis and growth. As atmospheric CO2 declined, forests became less productive, providing less food for the animals that depended on them. The combination of cooling temperatures and declining CO2 levels created a double stress on forest ecosystems that had been stable for millions of years. Trees that might have survived moderate cooling found themselves unable to cope when reduced CO2 made photosynthesis less efficient. The result was accelerated forest decline across vast areas of Africa, Europe, and Asia. For our ancestors, this meant not just habitat loss, but fundamental changes in the nature of their environment. The abundant, predictable food sources of the forest were being replaced by sparser, more scattered resources that required new strategies to exploit. The dense canopy that had provided protection from predators and weather was giving way to open landscapes where survival required entirely different skills. As ocean-driven climate change continued its relentless march, the evolutionary pressure on early hominid populations intensified. Those groups that could adapt to coastal environments, exploit marine resources, and develop flexible responses to environmental variability began to diverge from their more conservative, forest-dwelling relatives. The stage was being set for the dramatic evolutionary innovations that would eventually lead to the emergence of our own species. The transformation of Earth's oceans during the late Miocene was thus far more than just a backdrop to human evolution. It was an active driver of the environmental changes that forced our ancestors out of their comfortable forest homes and onto the long, challenging path that would eventually lead to modern humanity. Without these oceanic changes, our species might never have evolved at all, remaining instead as successful forest apes in a world that remained forever green and stable. But the oceans weren't finished with their transformative work. The changes that had begun in the late Miocene would continue and accelerate, eventually giving rise to the dramatic Ice Age cycles that would provide the final crucible for human evolution. The cooling seas had lit a fuse that would burn for millions of years, reshaping not just the climate, but the very trajectory of life on Earth. The atmospheric changes triggered by these oceanic transformations were creating a cascade of effects that reached far beyond the seas themselves. As the late Miocene progressed toward its close, the very air our ancestors breathed was becoming fundamentally different from what had sustained life for the previous millions of years. The declining atmospheric carbon dioxide wasn't just affecting plant growth, it was altering the fundamental chemistry of photosynthesis itself. Plants had evolved sophisticated mechanisms to capture CO2 from the air, but these systems worked most efficiently under the high carbon dioxide conditions that had characterized most of Earth's history. As atmospheric CO2 levels dropped from their middle Miocene peaks, many plant species found themselves operating at the limits of their biochemical capabilities. This created what botanists call the C4 revolution. Some plants, particularly grasses, developed entirely new photosynthetic pathways that could operate efficiently even under low CO2 conditions. These C4 plants, named for the 4 carbon molecules they produce during photosynthesis, had a massive competitive advantage in the new low-carbon world. They could photosynthesize more efficiently, use water more effectively, and tolerate higher temperatures than their C3 competitors. The rise of C4 grasses fundamentally altered terrestrial ecosystems across the globe. Vast areas that had once supported forests now became dominated by grasslands. These weren't the sparse, scattered grasslands we might imagine, but dense, continuous prairies that stretched for hundreds of miles without interruption. The transformation was so dramatic that paleontologists can trace it in the fossil record through changes in the carbon isotope ratios of ancient soils and teeth. For our early ancestors, this grass revolution created entirely new landscapes to navigate. The dense understory of forest floors with their familiar fruits, nuts, and edible plants gave way to open grasslands dominated by species that were largely inedible to primates. The foods that had sustained forest-dwelling apes for millions of years simply weren't available in these new environments. But the grasslands weren't empty of life. They supported massive herds of grazing animals, from ancient horses and antelopes to early elephants and rhinoceroses. These herbivore populations had exploded as the nutritious C4 grasses spread, creating what paleontologists call the Great American Interchange. Though similar processes were occurring on every continent, the abundance of large herbivores attracted equally impressive populations of predators. Saber-toothed cats, early hyenas, and massive predatory birds patrolled these grasslands, creating a dangerous environment for any primate bold enough to venture away from the safety of trees. Yet some early hominid populations did exactly that. Driven by necessity as their forest refuges continued to shrink, these grassland pioneers faced challenges that would have seemed insurmountable to their forest-dwelling ancestors. Walking upright across open terrain for long distances required entirely different locomotive adaptations. The curved spine and long arms that worked so well for brachiation through trees became liabilities when covering ground efficiently. Natural selection began favoring individuals with straighter spines, shorter arms, and longer legs better suited for terrestrial locomotion. The dietary challenges were equally severe. Grass seeds were tiny and required enormous effort to collect in meaningful quantities. The leaves were often tough and fibrous, difficult to digest without specialized gut adaptations that early hominids lacked. But the grasslands did offer resources for those clever enough to exploit them. Underground storage organs, roots and tubers that grasses used to survive dry seasons and fires provided concentrated sources of carbohydrates for those willing to dig them up. This underground larder may have been one of the key resources that allowed early hominids to survive in grassland environments, but accessing it required tools. Sharp sticks for digging, stones for pounding tough roots into digestible pulp, containers for carrying water across the long distances between sources. Tool use, which had been optional in the resource-rich forests, became essential for survival in the grasslands. The social implications of grassland life were equally transformative. In forests, Individuals or small family groups could survive independently, finding sufficient resources within limited territories. But grasslands were patchy environments, where resources were often scattered across vast distances. Water sources might be separated by days of travel. Seasonal foods appeared and disappeared according to rainfall patterns that could vary dramatically from year to year. These conditions favored larger social groups that could coordinate their movements and share information about resource locations. Groups that could communicate effectively about distant water sources, seasonal food availability, and predator movements had enormous advantages over those that couldn't. This pressure for enhanced communication may have been one of the crucial drivers in the evolution of early language capabilities. The seasonal nature of grassland resources also required new forms of planning and foresight. Unlike the relatively stable food supplies of tropical forests, grassland resources were highly variable both spatially and temporally. Groups that could remember the locations of seasonal foods, plan migrations to coincide with resource availability, and coordinate their movements with other groups had much better survival prospects. This cognitive challenge, the need to hold complex mental maps of resource distribution across vast landscapes and long time scales, may have been another key driver of brain evolution in early hominids. The individuals who could remember where the best tuber beds were located, when different grass species produced their seeds, and how to navigate between distant water sources would have been invaluable to their social groups. The expansion of grasslands also created new forms of environmental variability that went far beyond the seasonal cycles that had characterized forest environments. Grasslands are inherently unstable ecosystems, subject to fires, droughts, and dramatic fluctuations in animal populations. A region that supported abundant resources one year might be virtually barren the next, forcing constant adaptation and movement. This environmental unpredictability placed enormous pressure on early hominid populations to develop flexible response strategies. Groups that were locked into rigid behavioral patterns that couldn't adapt quickly to changing conditions were more likely to face local extinction when their usual resources failed. Those that could modify their behavior, switch between different survival strategies, and exploit new opportunities as they arose had much better long-term prospects. The fire ecology of grasslands introduced entirely new environmental pressures. Unlike forests, which burn infrequently and catastrophically, grasslands experienced regular, low-intensity fires that were actually essential for ecosystem health. These fires cleared away dead plant material, recycled nutrients, and prevented woody plants from invading grassland areas, but they also created a landscape of constant, low-level environmental disturbance. Early hominids living in grassland environments had to adapt to this fire regime. Groups that learned to use fire as a tool, to predict its patterns and even to control it for their own purposes, gained enormous advantages. Fire could be used to drive game animals, to clear travel routes, to process foods, and to provide protection from predators during vulnerable nighttime hours. The mastery of fire may have been one of the most crucial technological breakthroughs in early human evolution. It provided warmth that allowed expansion into cooler climates, light that extended the useful hours of each day, and cooking that made many previously inedible foods nutritious and safe. But fire mastery also required sophisticated social coordination and knowledge transmission that pushed the boundaries of early hominid cognitive abilities. As the late Miocene gave way to the Pliocene, roughly 5 million years ago, these grassland adaptations were becoming increasingly important for hominid survival. The climate continued its inexorable cooling trend, and forest environments continued their retreat to equatorial refugia. The future belonged to those lineages that could master life in the open savannas, but mastering grassland life required more than just individual adaptations. It demanded new forms of social organization, technological innovation, and cultural transmission that would eventually distinguish the human lineage from all other primates. The groups that successfully made this transition weren't just surviving in grassland environments. They were laying the groundwork for the complex societies and technologies that would eventually allow humans to colonize every habitable environment on Earth. The atmospheric and ecological changes of the late Miocene had created a crucible that tested every aspect of early hominid biology and behavior. Those that passed the test didn't just survive, they were transformed into something entirely new. The tree-dwelling apes of the Middle Miocene forests were becoming the ground-walking, tool-using, fire-mastering ancestors of modern humanity. Yet even as these grassland adaptations were taking hold, the climate system was preparing to deliver an even greater challenge. The cooling that had driven the expansion of grasslands was accelerating, and new feedback mechanisms were coming into play that would eventually plunge the planet into the dramatic ice age cycles of the Pleistocene. The evolutionary journey that had begun with the retreat of Miocene forests was far from over. The transformation of atmospheric chemistry during this period extended far beyond carbon dioxide levels. Oxygen concentrations were also shifting in subtle but significant ways that affected both plant and animal life. The massive burial of organic carbon in marine sediments as oceanic productivity patterns changed was slowly altering the atmospheric balance between oxygen and carbon dioxide. Higher oxygen levels, while beneficial for animal metabolism, also increased the risk of catastrophic fires. The grasslands that were expanding across continents became increasingly fire-prone as atmospheric oxygen concentrations rose. This created a feedback loop where more fires led to more grassland expansion, which led to even more fire-prone landscapes. Our ancestors had to adapt not just to living in grasslands, but to living in grasslands that burned regularly and unpredictably. The changing atmospheric composition also affected the evolution of respiratory systems in both plants and animals. Species that could extract oxygen more efficiently from the air, or that could tolerate brief periods of reduced oxygen availability during fires or other environmental disturbances, had competitive advantages. This may have been one of the factors driving the evolution of more efficient cardiovascular systems in early hominids. As volcanic activity increased in some regions, responding to the tectonic forces that were reshaping continents, ash and sulfur compounds periodically altered atmospheric chemistry on regional scales. These volcanic episodes created short-term cooling events that could devastate local ecosystems while simultaneously fertilizing soils with mineral-rich ash. Early hominid populations had to navigate not just long-term climate trends, but also these unpredictable short-term disruptions. The dust loading of the atmosphere was also increasing as grasslands expanded and seasonal droughts became more common. This atmospheric dust affected local climate patterns, often reducing rainfall and creating feedback loops that accelerated grassland expansion at the expense of forests. The hazy, dust-laden skies of the late Miocene would have been dramatically different from the clear tropical atmospheres of earlier epochs. These atmospheric changes were creating new selective pressures that went far beyond simple temperature and rainfall shifts. The quality of light reaching the Earth's surface was changing as dust and aerosols altered atmospheric transmission. This affected plant photosynthesis and may have influenced the evolution of visual systems in animals, including our early ancestors. The electromagnetic properties of the atmosphere were also shifting in ways that affected animal navigation systems. Many species rely on subtle magnetic and electrical cues for orientation and migration, and changes in atmospheric conductivity and magnetic field interactions may have disrupted these systems. Early hominids developing long-distance travel capabilities would have needed to develop new navigation strategies as traditional environmental cues became less reliable. Sound transmission through the atmosphere was affected by changes in temperature gradients and humidity patterns. The acoustic environment that had characterized forest-dwelling primate communication was being replaced by the very different sound transmission properties of open grasslands. This may have been another factor driving the evolution of more sophisticated vocal communication systems in early hominids. The ultraviolet radiation reaching the Earth's surface was increasing in some regions as atmospheric ozone patterns shifted in response to changing circulation patterns. This created new selective pressures for skin pigmentation and other protective adaptations. Early hominids venturing into open grassland environments faced increased UV exposure that their forest-adapted physiology wasn't prepared to handle. All of these atmospheric changes were interconnected, creating a complex web of environmental pressures that affected every aspect of life on Earth. For early hominids, adapting to this new atmospheric environment required not just physiological changes, but behavioral and technological innovations that would set them apart from other primate lineages. The mastery of shelter construction became increasingly important as atmospheric conditions became more variable and extreme. Simple forest sleeping nests were inadequate for protection from the dust storms, temperature extremes, and increased UV radiation of grassland environments. Early hominids began developing more sophisticated shelter technologies that would eventually evolve into the architectural traditions that characterize human societies. Clothing and body decoration also took on new importance as protection from atmospheric hazards became crucial for survival. The use of animal skins, plant fibers, and mineral pigments for protection and communication may have had its origins in the atmospheric challenges of the late Miocene transition. As we trace the atmospheric transformation of the late Miocene, we see how seemingly abstract changes in gas concentrations and particle loadings created concrete survival challenges that shaped every aspect of early hominid evolution. The air itself was becoming a selective force, favoring those lineages that could adapt to its changing chemistry and physical properties. This atmospheric evolution would continue and accelerate as the planet moved toward the Ice Age cycles of the Pleistocene. But already, in these early stages of atmospheric change, the foundations of human adaptability were being laid. The species that would eventually master every atmospheric environment on Earth, from tropical rainforests to Arctic tundra, were learning their first lessons in atmospheric survival in the dust-laden skies of the late Miocene grasslands. The atmospheric transformation wasn't happening in isolation. Deep beneath the Earth's surface, another force was stirring that would amplify every climate change already underway. Volcanic activity was increasing across the globe, not the dramatic explosive eruptions that capture headlines, but something far more insidious. Massive flood basalt provinces were beginning to form, pouring millions of tons of lava across vast landscapes, while simultaneously pumping sulfur compounds and carbon dioxide into an already stressed atmosphere. The Columbia River basalts in North America were among the most significant of these volcanic episodes. Over the course of several million years, they would cover an area larger than most modern countries with layer upon layer of solidified lava. But it wasn't the lava itself that mattered most for global climate. It was the gases released during these prolonged eruptions. Sulfur dioxide from volcanic emissions created aerosol particles high in the atmosphere that reflected sunlight back to space, contributing to global cooling. But volcanic carbon dioxide had the opposite effect, adding to atmospheric greenhouse gases, even as other processes were removing them. This created a complex push-pull dynamic, where volcanic episodes could cause short-term cooling, followed by longer periods of enhanced warming. For our early ancestors, these volcanic climate disruptions added another layer of unpredictability to an already challenging environment. A region that had adapted to gradual cooling might suddenly experience several years of volcanic winter, followed by decades of enhanced warming as atmospheric aerosols settled out and volcanic CO2 accumulated. These rapid shifts in climate conditions tested the limits of early hominid adaptability. The ash from major volcanic eruptions also had profound effects on local ecosystems. Volcanic ash is rich in minerals that can fertilize soils, but it can also bury vegetation and contaminate water sources. Early hominid groups living in volcanically active regions had to develop strategies for surviving these periodic catastrophes, while also learning to exploit the enhanced soil fertility that followed. Some researchers argue that volcanic ash may have played a crucial role in early tool development. The fine-grained abrasive properties of volcanic ash made it useful for polishing and sharpening stone tools. Regions with regular volcanic activity may have provided early hominids with superior tool-making materials, giving them competitive advantages in food processing and other survival activities. The timing of major volcanic episodes wasn't random. They were linked to the same tectonic forces that were driving mountain building and continental drift. As the African continent moved northward, colliding with Europe and Asia, it created zones of crustal instability that manifested as increased volcanic activity. The Great Rift Valley system that runs through eastern Africa was beginning to form during this period, creating a chain of volcanoes and associated geological instability. This geological activity had direct implications for early hominid evolution because many of the most important fossil sites lie along the Rift Valley system. The volcanic ash layers that make precise dating of fossils possible also document the environmental challenges our ancestors faced. Each ash layer represents a catastrophic event that local populations had to survive, adapt to, or perish. The mineral-rich volcanic soils of the Rift Valley created unique ecological conditions that may have been crucial for early hominid survival. These soils supported different plant communities than the surrounding landscapes, often with higher concentrations of essential nutrients. Groups that learned to exploit these volcanic oases had access to resources unavailable elsewhere. But volcanic regions also presented unique dangers. Toxic gases could accumulate in low-lying areas, creating death traps for unwary animals and early hominids. Hot springs and fumaroles could cause severe burns. Sudden eruptions could bury entire landscapes in ash or lava. Learning to live safely in volcanically active regions required sophisticated environmental knowledge and risk assessment capabilities. The psychological effects of living in such dynamic geological environments may have been as important as the physical challenges. Constant reminders of the Earth's power to reshape landscapes overnight could have contributed to the development of planning abilities and long-term thinking that would become crucial human traits. Groups that could anticipate geological hazards and plan accordingly would have had significant survival advantages. As volcanic activity intensified during the late Miocene, it created what geologists call a volcanic winter effect on a global scale. The cumulative impact of multiple volcanic regions releasing aerosols simultaneously could cool global temperatures by several degrees for decades at a time. These cooling episodes accelerated the retreat of forests and the expansion of grasslands, creating additional pressure on early hominid populations. The interaction between volcanic emissions and existing atmospheric chemistry created complex feedback loops that amplified climate changes. Volcanic sulfur compounds could interact with water vapor to create acid rain that damaged vegetation over vast areas. Volcanic carbon dioxide could enhance the greenhouse effect during periods when other factors were causing cooling, creating rapid temperature swings that stressed ecosystems beyond their adaptive capacity. Ocean chemistry was also affected by increased volcanic activity. Volcanic emissions changed the acidity and mineral content of seawater, affecting marine ecosystems that were already stressed by cooling temperatures and changing circulation patterns. These marine changes, in turn, affected coastal environments that were becoming increasingly important for early hominid survival. The dust and aerosols from volcanic eruptions altered weather patterns in ways that could persist for years after individual eruptions ended. Monsoon systems could be disrupted, causing droughts in some regions and floods in others. The reliable seasonal rainfall patterns that many ecosystems depended on became increasingly erratic as volcanic emissions interfered with normal atmospheric circulation. Early hominids living through this period of increased volcanic activity were experiencing environmental challenges that would have been unimaginable to their forest-dwelling ancestors. Not only were they dealing with long-term climate cooling and habitat fragmentation, but they also faced unpredictable short-term disruptions that could devastate local environments within months or even weeks. Yet some populations not only survived, but thrived in these volcanically active regions. The fossil record shows that some of the most significant evolutionary developments in early hominid history occurred in areas with high levels of geological activity. This suggests that while volcanic environments were challenging, they also provided unique opportunities for evolutionary innovation. The need to respond quickly to volcanic hazards may have selected for enhanced cognitive abilities and social cooperation. Groups that could rapidly assess changing conditions, communicate effectively about dangers, and coordinate evacuation or resource gathering activities would have been much more likely to survive volcanic disasters. Toolmaking may have been accelerated by volcanic environments that provided both raw materials and urgent needs for specialized implements. Volcanic glass, or obsidian, creates some of the sharpest cutting edges known, and early hominids in volcanic regions had access to this superior toolstone. The need to process foods quickly during volcanic emergencies may have driven innovations in food preparation technology. Fire control abilities would have been especially valuable in volcanic regions where natural fires were common but unpredictable. Groups that could manage fire effectively could use it for protection, food processing, and signaling, while also being able to control or escape from dangerous wildfires triggered by volcanic activity. The social structures needed to survive in volcanic environments may have been more complex than those required for stable forest life. Leadership roles might have been crucial during emergencies, and the ability to make rapid group decisions could mean the difference between survival and extinction. These social innovations would have had lasting effects on early hominid cultural evolution. As the late Miocene progressed toward its close, the combination of long-term climate cooling and increased volcanic activity was creating environmental conditions unlike anything Earth had experienced for tens of millions of years. The stable, predictable world that had nurtured early ape evolution was being replaced by a dynamic, often dangerous landscape that demanded constant adaptation. The volcanic legacy of this period would continue to influence human evolution for millions of years to come. The geological instability that characterized the late Miocene transition created the Rift Valley systems where many crucial early hominid fossils have been found. The ash layers from ancient eruptions provide the chronological framework that allows us to understand the timing of evolutionary changes. But perhaps most importantly, the environmental pressures created by volcanic activity during this crucial period may have been one of the key factors that drove the evolution of human intelligence, adaptability, and social complexity. The ancestors who survived the volcanic crucible of the late Miocene weren't just physically different from their forest-dwelling predecessors. They were cognitively and socially transformed, possessing the flexibility and innovation that would eventually allow their descendants to colonize every environment on Earth. The volcanic fires that had tested early hominid survival were forging the mental and social tools that would define human civilization. In the glow of ancient eruptions, the foundations of human culture were being laid by populations that had learned to thrive in the face of constant environmental challenge and change. The volcanic upheavals were only part of a much larger story unfolding beneath our ancestors' feet. While eruptions painted the skies with ash and reshaped landscapes overnight, deeper forces were at work that would prove even more transformative. The very ground they walked on was moving, shifting, cracking apart in ways that would fundamentally alter the geography of their world. The East African Rift System was beginning to tear the continent apart. This wasn't the sudden, dramatic splitting you might imagine from disaster movies, but a geological process so gradual that thousands of generations would live and die before its effects became obvious. Yet for the early hominids caught in its grip, This continental breakup would create opportunities and challenges that would push evolution in entirely new directions. Picture the landscape 10 million years ago. Eastern Africa was a relatively flat, forested region, with gentle rivers meandering toward ancient coastlines. But deep beneath this peaceful surface, massive forces were building. The African tectonic plate was being stretched and pulled by convection currents in the Earth's mantle, creating zones of weakness that would eventually become the dramatic rift valleys we see today. As the rifting process began, it didn't create sudden chasms or earthquakes that shattered the landscape. Instead, it started with subtle changes that early hominids might not have noticed within a single lifetime. The land began to subside in certain areas, creating shallow depressions that collected water during rainy seasons. These seasonal lakes and wetlands became oases of life in an increasingly arid landscape. But the rifting process also created barriers. As some areas sank, others were uplifted, forming escarpments and highlands that blocked traditional migration routes. Early hominid populations that had once moved freely across continuous forest landscapes found themselves increasingly isolated by these growing geographical barriers. The isolation wasn't immediate or complete. For hundreds of thousands of years, populations on either side of developing rift valleys could still interbreed occasionally, maintaining genetic connections across the slowly widening gaps. But as the rifting continued and the barriers grew higher and more formidable, gene flow between populations gradually decreased to a trickle, then stopped entirely. This geographical isolation created what evolutionary biologists call allopatric speciation on a massive scale. Populations that had been part of a single, genetically continuous group found themselves facing different environmental pressures on either side of the growing rift. Some lived in the highlands, created by rifting, dealing with cooler temperatures and different vegetation. Others inhabited the rift floor, experiencing unique climatic conditions and novel ecological challenges. The rift valleys themselves became evolutionary laboratories. The combination of volcanic activity, unique drainage patterns, and specialized microclimates created environmental conditions that existed nowhere else on Earth. Lakes that formed in the deepest parts of the rift had unusual water chemistry due to volcanic inputs and limited drainage. The vegetation around these lakes was unlike anything found in surrounding regions. Early hominids living in these rift environments faced survival challenges that their relatives in more stable regions never encountered. Seasonal flooding could make large areas uninhabitable for months at a time, forcing populations to develop more sophisticated planning and resource storage capabilities. The unique plant and animal communities of the rift required entirely new foraging strategies and dietary adaptations, but the rift valleys also provided unprecedented opportunities. The lakes and wetlands supported fish populations that could provide reliable protein sources for groups that learned to exploit them. Seasonal waterfowl migrations brought additional hunting opportunities. The mineral-rich soils created by volcanic activity supported unique plant communities that could provide foods and materials unavailable elsewhere. The psychological and cognitive demands of Rift Valley life were equally transformative. The dramatic topography created complex navigation challenges that required sophisticated spatial memory and planning abilities. Groups needed to remember the locations of seasonal resources across landscapes where a wrong turn could lead to impassable cliffs or treacherous swamps. The unpredictable flooding and drying cycles of rift lakes demanded flexible behavioral responses and long-term planning capabilities. Groups that could anticipate seasonal changes, store resources during abundant periods, and coordinate their movements to avoid environmental hazards had enormous advantages over those locked into rigid behavioral patterns. Social cooperation became even more crucial in rift environments where individual survival was often impossible. The complex topography meant that information about resources, hazards, and seasonal changes needed to be shared across extended networks. Groups that developed effective communication systems and cooperative resource-sharing arrangements were much more likely to survive the challenges of Rift Valley life. Tool use took on new dimensions in rift environments where specialized implements were often essential for survival. Digging tools for extracting tubers from volcanic soils, fishing implements for exploiting lake resources, climbing aids for navigating steep escarpments. The diversity of environmental challenges in rift valleys may have been one of the key drivers of early technological innovation. The geological instability of rift regions also created unique preservation conditions that have provided crucial insights into early hominid evolution. Volcanic ash layers provided perfect conditions for fossilization, while also creating chronological markers that allow precise dating of evolutionary changes. Many of our most important early hominid fossils come from Rift Valley deposits that would never have formed without the geological processes that were tearing Africa apart. But perhaps most importantly, the rift valleys created environmental conditions that favored the evolution of bipedalism. The complex topography and open landscapes of rift environments provided selective advantages for individuals who could walk efficiently on two legs. Bipedalism allowed better visibility across rough terrain, freed the hands for carrying tools and resources, and enabled more efficient long-distance travel across the varied landscapes of the rift. The transition to bipedalism wasn't just a physical change. It was a cognitive and social revolution that opened up entirely new ways of life. Freed hands could manipulate tools with unprecedented precision, carry resources over long distances, and communicate through gesture and sign. The upright posture associated with bipedalism also changed social dynamics, affecting everything from mating displays to group coordination. As the rifting process continued through the late Miocene and into the Pliocene, it created an increasingly complex landscape of isolated populations facing unique environmental challenges. Some groups retreated to remaining forest refugia, becoming the ancestors of modern chimpanzees and gorillas. Others embraced the challenges of Rift Valley life, developing the adaptations that would eventually lead to modern humans. The Rift Valleys were becoming crucibles of human evolution, places where environmental challenges and opportunities combined to create selective pressures unlike anything our ancestors had previously experienced. The populations that thrived in these dynamic environments weren't just surviving, they were being transformed into something entirely new. The geological forces that were reshaping Africa weren't finished with their transformative work. The rifting that had begun in the east was part of a larger pattern of continental restructuring that would eventually affect climate patterns across the globe. As Africa continued its northward drift and collision with Eurasia, it was creating mountain ranges and closing ocean passages that would fundamentally alter global circulation patterns. The ongoing collision between Africa and Europe was slowly closing the Tethys Sea, that ancient tropical ocean that had separated the continents for hundreds of millions of years. As this seaway narrowed, it was redirecting ocean currents and changing the distribution of heat around the globe. The Mediterranean Sea, that familiar body of water we know today, was actually a remnant of this much larger ancient ocean system. The closure of tropical seaways had profound implications for global climate, because it was forcing warm equatorial waters to find new circulation patterns. Instead of flowing freely between ocean basins in tropical latitudes, warm water was being redirected toward polar regions, setting up the circulation patterns that would eventually trigger ice age cycles. Meanwhile, the Isthmus of Panama was continuing its slow emergence from the Pacific, gradually restricting the flow of water between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. This geological dam was forcing major reorganization of global ocean circulation, with effects that reached far beyond the tropical Americas where the land bridge was forming. These large-scale geological changes were creating a cascade of environmental effects that reached every corner of the globe. As ocean circulation patterns shifted, regional climates that had been stable for millions of years began experiencing unprecedented variability. Some areas became much drier, others experienced increased rainfall, and many regions saw their seasonal patterns disrupted in ways that stressed ecosystems beyond their adaptive capacity. For early hominid populations, these global changes meant that environmental challenges weren't limited to local geological activity or regional climate shifts. They were part of a planetary-scale reorganization that was affecting ecosystems worldwide. Populations that might have migrated to escape local environmental problems found that suitable habitats were disappearing everywhere, forcing adaptations that went far beyond simple geographical relocation. The interconnected nature of these geological and climatic changes meant that evolutionary pressures were intensifying simultaneously across multiple continents. Early hominid populations in Africa weren't just competing with each other for dwindling forest resources. They were part of a global evolutionary experiment where similar environmental challenges were testing the adaptability of countless species worldwide. This synchronous global environmental change may have been one of the key factors that accelerated human evolution during the late Miocene transition. Instead of gradual, localized adaptations that might take millions of years to develop, early hominids were facing immediate survival challenges that demanded rapid evolutionary responses. The populations that could adapt quickly to changing conditions had enormous advantages, while those locked into rigid behavioral or physiological patterns faced extinction. The fossil record from this period shows evidence of rapid evolutionary change across many mammalian lineages, not just early hominids. This suggests that the environmental pressures created by global geological reorganization were testing the adaptive capacity of life itself, favoring those species that could respond flexibly to unprecedented challenges. As we trace the geological transformation of the late Miocene, we see how forces operating deep within the Earth were reshaping not just the physical landscape, but the evolutionary trajectory of life on its surface. The continents weren't just drifting randomly, they were creating new environmental challenges that would determine which species would survive to shape the future of our planet. The early hominids navigating these geological upheavals had no way of knowing that their responses to local environmental challenges were part of a much larger story of planetary change. But their success in adapting to Rift Valley life, in developing the cognitive and social innovations needed to survive in dynamic geological environments, was preparing them for the even greater challenges that lay ahead. The geological transformation that had begun in the late Miocene would continue for millions of years, eventually creating the dramatic Ice Age cycles that would provide the final crucible for human evolution. But already, in these early stages of continental reorganization, the foundations of human adaptability were being established by populations that had learned to thrive in a world where the very ground beneath their feet was constantly changing. The rift valleys had taught our ancestors that survival depended not on finding the perfect environment, but on developing the flexibility to adapt to whatever environment they found themselves in. This lesson in adaptability would prove to be the most valuable evolutionary inheritance they could pass on to future generations, the key to eventual human colonization of every habitat on Earth. As the late Miocene drew toward its close, the geological forces that had been reshaping Africa were beginning to interact with atmospheric and oceanic changes in ways that would amplify their effects dramatically. The stage was being set for a climatic transition so profound that it would fundamentally alter the trajectory of evolution on Earth. The quiet geological revolution of the Rift Valleys was about to become part of a much larger transformation that would test the limits of life's adaptability. But the geological upheavals weren't just creating physical barriers and new landscapes. They were also unleashing something far more subtle, yet equally transformative. A cascade of chemical changes that would alter the very building blocks of life itself. As ancient rock formations were exposed to weathering for the first time in millions of years, they began releasing minerals and trace elements into the environment in unprecedented concentrations. The rift valleys, with their fresh volcanic rocks and exposed geological formations, became natural laboratories for biogeochemical experimentation. Rainfall, washing over newly exposed basalt and granite, carried dissolved minerals into lakes and streams, creating water chemistry unlike anything that had existed during the stable forest period. These mineral-rich waters supported entirely new ecosystems, while simultaneously challenging existing life forms with novel chemical environments. For early hominids, these chemical changes created both opportunities and hazards that their forest-dwelling ancestors had never encountered. Some of the newly available minerals were essential nutrients that could support better health and cognitive development. Others were toxic compounds that required new physiological adaptations or behavioral strategies to avoid. The ability to distinguish between beneficial and harmful chemical environments became a crucial survival skill. The exposure of deep rock layers also released radioactive elements into surface environments at levels that had been locked away for geological ages. This increased background radiation created additional evolutionary pressure, favoring individuals with better DNA repair mechanisms and cellular protection systems. While the radiation levels weren't immediately lethal, they may have accelerated mutation rates and evolutionary change during this crucial period. Trace elements crucial for brain development became available in higher concentrations as geological weathering accelerated. Copper, zinc, iron, and other minerals essential for neural function were washing out of exposed rock formations and concentrating in the lakes and streams where early hominids obtained their water. This mineral enrichment may have been one of the factors that supported the evolution of larger, more complex brains during this period. But the chemical changes weren't limited to water sources. The soils developing on fresh volcanic rocks had entirely different mineral compositions than the ancient forest soils our ancestors were adapted to. Plants growing in these new soils accumulated different concentrations of nutrients and toxins, creating novel dietary challenges and opportunities for herbivorous animals and the early hominids that depended on them. The dust storms that became increasingly common as grasslands expanded were also carrying chemical signals across vast distances. Minerals from distant volcanic eruptions or exposed rock formations could be transported hundreds of miles by wind, creating chemical gradients that animals could potentially use for navigation or resource location. Early hominids with the ability to interpret these chemical cues might have gained significant advantages in finding water, food, or suitable habitats. Salt, which had been a rare and precious resource during the forest period, became more readily available as Rift Valley lakes concentrated minerals through evaporation cycles. This increased salt availability had profound implications for early hominid physiology, allowing them to maintain electrolyte balance more effectively during the increased physical activity required for terrestrial life. The chemical signature of the late Miocene transition is still visible today in the isotopic composition of fossil teeth and bones from this period. These chemical markers tell us that our ancestors were experiencing dietary and environmental changes far more dramatic than simple shifts in temperature or rainfall. They were adapting to a fundamentally different chemical world. Marine environments were also experiencing chemical changes as increased weathering from exposed continental rocks altered ocean chemistry. The influx of minerals from accelerated erosion changed seawater composition in ways that affected marine food webs, with cascading effects on coastal ecosystems where some early hominid populations were beginning to forage. Heavy metals released from geological formations created new toxicological challenges that required behavioral and physiological adaptations. Lead, mercury, and other toxic elements became more concentrated in certain environments, creating selection pressure for individuals who could avoid contaminated areas or tolerate higher exposure levels. The interaction between these chemical changes and existing biological systems created feedback loops that accelerated evolutionary change. Plants that could tolerate or exploit new soil chemistry gained competitive advantages, leading to rapid shifts in vegetation composition. These plant community changes, in turn, affected the animals that depended on them, creating cascading effects throughout entire ecosystems. Medicinal plants that had been effective in the stable chemical environment of Miocene forests might no longer work as effectively in the altered chemical landscape of the late Miocene. Early hominids, with the cognitive flexibility to experiment with new plant medicines or to modify traditional remedies for changed conditions, would have had significant health advantages. The chemical transformation of the late Miocene was thus far more than just a side effect of geological change. It was an active driver of evolutionary innovation that affected every aspect of early hominid biology and behavior. The populations that successfully navigated this chemical transition weren't just surviving environmental change, they were being chemically transformed into something new. As we trace the chemical legacy of this period, we see how geological forces operating over millions of years created the specific environmental conditions that allowed human intelligence and adaptability to evolve. The chemical challenges of the late Miocene transition may have been one of the crucial factors that selected for the cognitive flexibility and innovative thinking that would eventually distinguish humans from all other species. The chemical revolution of the late Miocene was preparing our ancestors for an even greater transformation that lay ahead. The populations that had learned to thrive in the chemically dynamic environments of rift valleys were developing the physiological and behavioral tools they would need to survive the dramatic climatic cycles that were about to begin. But chemical adaptation required more than just individual survival. It demanded new forms of social learning and cultural transmission that would allow successful chemical survival strategies to be passed between generations. The early hominids of the late Miocene were thus not only evolving new physiologies, they were developing the foundations of the cultural learning systems that would eventually become humanity's greatest evolutionary advantage. The chemical crucible of the late Miocene had tested every aspect of early hominid biology and found some populations capable of not just survival, but transformation. These chemical pioneers were being forged into ancestors capable of adapting to any environment Earth might create, setting the stage for the remarkable journey that would eventually carry their descendants to every corner of the globe. The chemical pioneers emerging from this late Miocene crucible were developing something unprecedented in the history of life on Earth. Not just individual adaptations to environmental change, but collective strategies that could be shared, modified, and passed down through generations. This wasn't the simple behavioral copying seen in other animal species. It was the birth of cumulative cultural evolution, the process that would eventually allow humans to adapt to environments faster than their genes could change. In the rift valleys and emerging grasslands, early hominid groups were facing chemical challenges that no individual could solve alone. Identifying which water sources contained beneficial minerals versus toxic compounds required experimentation that could prove fatal. Determining which plants growing in altered soils were safe to eat demanded trial and error that individual families couldn't afford. But groups that could pool their knowledge, share discoveries, and learn from each other's mistakes had enormous survival advantages. This collective problem-solving created new forms of social organization that went far beyond the simple family groups that had characterized forest-dwelling primates. Extended networks of information sharing began developing, allowing successful innovations to spread rapidly through populations while preventing the repeated rediscovery of dangerous mistakes. The cognitive demands of participating in these knowledge networks may have been one of the key drivers of brain expansion during this period. The development of proto-language capabilities became crucial for sharing complex information about chemical environments. Simple calls and gestures that had been sufficient for forest life couldn't convey the nuanced information needed to navigate the chemical complexity of late Miocene landscapes. Groups that developed more sophisticated communication systems could share detailed knowledge about resource locations, seasonal variations in water chemistry, and the subtle signs that indicated safe versus dangerous chemical environments. But perhaps most importantly, these early hominid populations were learning to modify their chemical environment rather than simply adapting to it. The controlled use of fire, which may have begun during this period, allowed them to detoxify foods, purify water, and create chemical signals for communication and territorial marking. This wasn't just tool use. It was the beginning of environmental engineering on a scale that would eventually reshape the entire planet. The social implications of chemical mastery extended far beyond survival. Groups that could control fire had advantages in food processing, predator deterrence, and social bonding that went far beyond basic nutrition and safety. Fire became a focal point for social interaction, a technology that extended the useful hours of each day and created new opportunities for information sharing and cultural transmission. The knowledge required to maintain fire safely in the volatile chemical environments of the late Miocene was substantial. Understanding which materials burned cleanly versus those that produced toxic smoke, knowing how to control fire in windy grassland conditions, recognizing the chemical signs that indicated fire danger. This technical knowledge had to be transmitted accurately between generations, creating pressure for more sophisticated teaching and learning capabilities. As populations spread across the increasingly diverse chemical landscape of late Miocene Africa, they encountered environmental challenges that required rapid innovation. Groups that could quickly develop new chemical survival strategies and share them effectively within their communities could colonize new habitats much faster than those dependent on slow genetic adaptation alone. The chemical diversity of Rift Valley environments also created opportunities for specialization that hadn't existed in the relatively uniform forest environments of earlier periods. Some groups became experts in exploiting alkaline lake resources. Others specialized in volcanic soil environments, and still others focused on the unique chemical opportunities of seasonal wetlands. This ecological specialization drove cultural diversification that laid the groundwork for the remarkable cultural diversity that would eventually characterize human societies. Trade relationships began developing as groups, with access to different chemical resources, started exchanging materials and knowledge. Salt from evaporated lake beds, obsidian from volcanic outcrops, medicinal plants from specialized chemical environments. These early trade networks created social connections that could span vast distances, allowing innovations to spread rapidly across entire regions. The memory demands of chemical survival were enormous. Successful groups needed to remember the seasonal chemistry of multiple water sources, the toxic properties of plants that changed with soil conditions, the chemical signatures that indicated different types of geological hazards. These cognitive challenges may have been crucial drivers of the enhanced memory capabilities that would eventually distinguish human cognition. Ritual behaviors began emerging around chemical survival strategies. Ceremonies marking the first rains that would alter water chemistry, ritual preparations of foods to reduce toxicity, social protocols for sharing knowledge about dangerous chemical environments. These weren't just cultural embellishments, they were practical systems for ensuring the crucial survival information was preserved and transmitted accurately. The chemical challenges of the late Miocene were also creating the first forms of primitive medicine. Groups that could identify plants with healing properties in altered soil conditions, that understood how to modify traditional remedies for new chemical environments, had significant advantages in surviving injury and illness. The development of pharmacological knowledge may have been one of the crucial innovations that allowed early hominids to thrive in chemically challenging environments. As the late Miocene transition accelerated, chemical adaptation became increasingly important for survival. Groups that had mastered fire control, developed sophisticated knowledge of plant chemistry, and created effective systems for sharing chemical survival information were expanding their ranges and populations. Those that couldn't adapt to the chemical complexity of the New World were retreating to ever smaller refugia or facing extinction. The chemical revolution was thus creating a new form of evolutionary selection that operated on cultural rather than genetic timescales. Populations that could innovate, learn, and adapt their behavior rapidly had enormous advantages over those dependent on slower biological adaptation alone. This cultural evolution was beginning to accelerate beyond anything seen in the biological world. By the end of the late Miocene, roughly 5 million years ago, these chemical pioneers had developed survival strategies that would serve them well in the even more challenging world that was emerging. The climate system was becoming increasingly unstable. Ice sheets were beginning to form at both poles, and the relatively predictable environmental conditions that had characterized most of Earth's history were giving way to dramatic cycles of cooling and warming. But the early hominids that had survived the chemical crucible of the late Miocene weren't just adapted to stable conditions. They had developed the cognitive flexibility, social cooperation, and cultural learning capabilities needed to thrive in a world of constant environmental change. The chemical challenges that had seemed so insurmountable at the beginning of this period had forged them into ancestors capable of adapting to anything the planet might create. The transformation wasn't complete. The Ice Age cycles that were beginning to develop would test these early cultural and cognitive innovations in ways that would push them to their absolute limits. But the foundations had been laid. The chemical pioneers of the late Miocene had developed the basic toolkit of human adaptability, the combination of intelligence, cooperation, and cultural learning that would eventually allow their descendants to colonize every environment on Earth. As we trace the chemical legacy of this crucial period, we see how environmental challenges that could have driven early hominids to extinction instead became the forge in which human adaptability was created. The chemical complexity of the late Miocene world had demanded innovations that went far beyond simple biological adaptation, creating the first glimmers of the cultural and technological mastery that would eventually define human civilization. The stage was now set for the final act of this evolutionary drama. The climate system that had been building toward instability throughout the late Miocene was about to deliver its ultimate challenge. The Ice Age cycles that would dominate the next several million years were beginning, and they would test every adaptation, every innovation, and every survival strategy that had emerged from the chemical crucible of the late Miocene transition. But this wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of a new chapter in which the chemical pioneers of the late Miocene would become the Ice Age survivors who would eventually give rise to modern humanity. The lessons learned in the rift valleys about chemical adaptation, social cooperation, and cultural learning would prove to be exactly the skills needed to survive in a world where massive ice sheets could appear and disappear within thousands of years, reshaping entire continents and forcing constant adaptation to environments that changed faster than any species had previously experienced. The chemical transformation of the late Miocene had prepared our ancestors for the ultimate test of adaptability. They had learned to read the chemical signatures of their environment, to modify dangerous substances into useful resources, and to share survival knowledge across extended social networks. These skills would prove invaluable as they faced the dramatic environmental swings of the approaching Ice Age cycles. The populations emerging from the late Miocene chemical crucible weren't just chemically adapted, they were cognitively transformed, possessing mental capabilities and social structures that no previous species had developed. The chemical challenges that had seemed so overwhelming at the beginning of this period had become the catalyst for innovations that would eventually allow humans to reshape the chemical environment of the entire planet. As the late Miocene drew to its close and the first Ice Age cycles began to develop, these chemical pioneers were ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. They had learned the most important lesson in the history of life on Earth, that survival didn't depend on finding the perfect environment, but on developing the ability to adapt to whatever environment you found yourself in. This lesson would carry them through the Ice Ages and beyond, eventually to the stars themselves. The chemical pioneers weren't the only ones undergoing transformation during this crucial period. As volcanic ash settled into lake beds and mineral-rich waters pooled in rift valleys, An entirely different kind of evolution was taking place in the microscopic realm. The bacteria, algae, and other microorganisms that formed the foundation of every ecosystem were adapting to the altered chemistry with a speed that would have seemed impossible to larger organisms. These microbial communities weren't just passive victims of environmental change. They were active participants in reshaping the chemical landscape, processing toxic compounds, concentrating essential minerals, and creating entirely new forms of symbiotic relationships with plants and animals. Some early hominid populations may have unknowingly benefited from these microbial innovations, gaining access to nutrients that had been locked away in indigestible forms. The gut microbiomes of early hominids were likely undergoing rapid evolution during this period as well. Populations that developed beneficial relationships with microorganisms capable of processing the novel plant compounds found in altered soil conditions would have had significant digestive advantages. This microbial evolution may have been one of the hidden factors that allowed some early hominid lineages to exploit new food sources, while others remained limited to increasingly scarce traditional resources. But the most dramatic microbial changes were occurring in the aquatic environments that were becoming crucial refugia during the late Miocene transition. As surface waters became more mineral-rich and chemically complex, they supported blooms of specialized microorganisms that could thrive in conditions that would have been toxic to most life forms. These microbial blooms created new food webs that early hominids were beginning to exploit. Seasonal algae blooms in Rift Valley lakes provided nutrition for small fish and crustaceans, which in turn supported larger aquatic animals that early hominids could hunt or scavenge. But these aquatic food webs were highly dynamic, appearing and disappearing according to chemical and climatic cycles that required sophisticated environmental knowledge to predict and exploit. The development of fishing technologies may have been driven partly by the need to harvest these seasonal aquatic resources before they disappeared. Simple spears and nets wouldn't have been sufficient for the complex fishing strategies required to exploit the unpredictable abundance of Rift Valley lakes. Early hominids needed to develop timing strategies, understanding when different species would be available and where they could be found within the complex chemical gradients of these unusual water bodies. Shellfish populations in coastal areas were also responding to changing ocean chemistry, as increased weathering from continental erosion altered seawater composition. Some species thrived in the new conditions, while others declined, creating shifting patterns of resource availability that coastal foraging groups had to track and adapt to. The ability to predict these population fluctuations based on environmental cues may have been one of the cognitive skills that distinguish successful coastal populations. The microbial processing of organic matter was also changing as decomposer communities adapted to new chemical conditions. Dead plant and animal material was being broken down by different microbial communities than had processed organic matter during the stable forest period. This altered decomposition created different soil chemistry and nutrient availability patterns that affected plant growth and ultimately the entire food web. Early hominids who understood these soil chemistry cycles could predict where the most nutritious plants would grow and when they would be available. This knowledge required understanding complex interactions between geology, climate, microbial activity, and plant growth that went far beyond simple seasonal awareness. Groups that developed this ecological sophistication could exploit resources that others couldn't even recognize. The fermentation of foods may have become increasingly important during this period as early hominids learned to use beneficial microorganisms to process otherwise indigestible plant materials. Controlled fermentation could break down toxic compounds, increase nutritional value, and preserve foods for times when fresh resources weren't available. But successful fermentation required understanding microbial ecology in ways that demanded careful observation and experimentation. Some researchers speculate that the consumption of naturally fermented fruits and other plant materials may have played a role in early hominid brain development. The alcohol and other compounds produced by fermentation could have had neurological effects that influence behavior and social interaction in ways that provided evolutionary advantages. But exploiting fermented foods safely required understanding the difference between beneficial fermentation and dangerous spoilage. The chemical complexity created by microbial activity also provided new opportunities for communication and social signaling. Different microbial communities produce different chemical signatures that could be detected by smell or taste. Early hominids who learned to interpret these chemical signals could gather information about water quality, food safety, territorial boundaries, and even the health status of other individuals. Territorial marking may have become more sophisticated during this period, as groups learned to use microbial chemistry for communication. Controlled fermentation of organic materials could create distinctive chemical signatures that conveyed information about group identity, resource claims, and social status. These chemical communication systems could persist in the environment much longer than vocal or visual signals, providing a form of information storage that extended beyond immediate social interactions. The medicinal use of microorganisms may also have emerged during this period as early hominids observed the effects of different microbial communities on health and healing. Clay eating, which is common among modern primates, may have become more important as a way of introducing beneficial microorganisms or absorbing toxic compounds. But effective clay use required understanding which types of clay contained helpful versus harmful microbial communities. Wound care and hygiene practices were likely influenced by growing awareness of microbial effects on health. Groups that learned to clean wounds with water from sources known to have beneficial microbial communities, or that understood which plant materials had antimicrobial properties, would have had significant advantages in surviving injuries and infections. The social implications of microbial knowledge were substantial. Individuals who could identify safe water sources, predict food spoilage, or treat infections with fermented plant medicines would have been valuable members of any social group. This specialized knowledge may have created new forms of social roles and status hierarchies based on technical expertise rather than just physical strength or social dominance. As early hominid groups became more mobile in response to environmental change, they encountered new microbial communities with each new habitat they entered. Some of these encounters were beneficial, providing access to new food processing capabilities or medicinal resources. Others were dangerous, exposing populations to pathogens they had no previous experience with. The ability to quickly assess and adapt to new microbial environments became a crucial survival skill. Disease ecology was also changing as environmental transformation brought different species into closer contact and created new pathways for pathogen transmission. Early hominids venturing into previously uninhabited ecological niches encountered new diseases, while also serving as bridges for pathogen transmission between previously isolated populations. Groups that developed effective strategies for disease prevention and treatment had enormous advantages. The development of cooking technologies may have been partly driven by the need to control microbial activity in foods. Heat treatment could kill dangerous microorganisms while preserving or enhancing beneficial ones. But effective cooking required understanding optimal temperatures, treatment times, and food preparation methods that went far beyond simply applying fire to organic matter. Food storage techniques were also evolving in response to changing microbial ecology. Traditional storage methods that had worked in stable forest environments might not be effective in the altered chemical conditions of late Miocene landscapes. Groups that could develop new preservation techniques or modify traditional methods for changed conditions could maintain food security during periods when fresh resources were unavailable. The seasonal timing of food collection and processing became more complex as microbial activity patterns changed with altered climate and chemistry. Understanding when different foods should be harvested to minimize spoilage, when fermentation conditions were optimal, and how long different preservation methods would remain effective required sophisticated knowledge of microbial ecology and environmental chemistry. By the end of the late Miocene, successful early hominid populations had developed remarkably sophisticated understanding of microbial processes and their applications to survival. This wasn't conscious scientific knowledge, but practical expertise gained through careful observation, experimentation, and cultural transmission. Groups that had mastered microbial ecology were better fed, healthier, and more capable of adapting to new environments than those that hadn't. The microbial innovations of the late Miocene were laying the groundwork for the food processing, preservation, and medicinal technologies that would eventually become fundamental aspects of human culture. The populations that had learned to work with, rather than against, microbial communities were developing capabilities that would prove invaluable as environmental challenges continued to intensify. As the climate system prepared to deliver its next great challenge in the form of ice age cycles, these microbial pioneers were equipped with biological and cultural tools that no previous species had possessed. They had learned to harness the power of microscopic life to enhance their own survival, creating partnerships with microbial communities that would eventually help them colonize every environment on Earth. The invisible world of microorganisms had become an active partner in early hominid evolution, providing resources, processing capabilities, and survival advantages that went far beyond what their own biology could achieve alone. This microbial partnership would prove to be one of the most important innovations to emerge from the late Miocene transition, a biological alliance that would eventually help shape human civilization itself. The transformation was accelerating now, building toward a climactic shift that would test every adaptation, every innovation, every survival strategy that had emerged from millions of years of environmental challenge. The late Miocene was ending, but its legacy would live on in the remarkable biological and cultural toolkit that its survivors were carrying forward into an uncertain future. The chemical and microbial innovations weren't developing in isolation. They were part of a much larger transformation in how early hominids related to their environment. A shift from passive adaptation to active environmental management that would eventually distinguish human societies from all other forms of life on Earth. The seeds of this transformation were being planted in the challenging landscapes of the late Miocene, watered by necessity and tended by intelligence that was growing more sophisticated with each passing generation. The convergence of all these forces, chemical, microbial, geological, and atmospheric, was creating something unprecedented in the history of life on Earth. Not just environmental change, but environmental chaos on a scale that would have overwhelmed any species dependent solely on genetic adaptation. Yet the early hominid populations scattered across this transforming landscape weren't just surviving. They were beginning to thrive in ways that defied every rule of evolutionary biology. What was emerging wasn't simply better adapted individuals, but something far more revolutionary. Entire populations were developing the ability to adapt faster than their environment could change. When volcanic eruptions altered water chemistry overnight, they could modify their behavior within days. When seasonal patterns shifted unpredictably, they could reorganize their resource-gathering strategies within weeks. When new diseases appeared, they could develop countermeasures within months. This wasn't the slow, grinding process of natural selection that had governed life for billions of years. This was something entirely new, a form of evolution that operated on cultural rather than biological timescales. Knowledge gained by one individual could spread through entire populations within a single generation. Innovations developed in one region could be transmitted across continents through social networks that spanned vast distances. The cognitive demands of this cultural evolution were staggering. Individuals needed to not just learn from their own experience, but to process, evaluate, and integrate information from dozens of other sources. They had to distinguish between reliable and unreliable information, between innovations that worked and those that failed, between knowledge that applied to their local conditions and that which was relevant only elsewhere. Memory became a survival tool unlike anything seen in the natural world. Successful individuals weren't just those who could remember where to find food or water, but those who could maintain detailed mental maps of resource availability across multiple seasons, elevation gradients, and chemical environments. They needed to remember not just what worked, but when it worked, where it worked, and why it might stop working. Language was evolving to meet these cognitive demands. The simple calls and gestures that had served forest-dwelling primates were being replaced by communication systems capable of conveying abstract concepts, temporal relationships, and causal connections. Early hominids were developing the ability to discuss things that weren't immediately present, to plan for future contingencies, and to share knowledge about complex environmental relationships. But perhaps most remarkably, they were beginning to teach. Not just the passive social learning seen in other species, where juveniles imitate adult behaviors, but active instruction, where knowledgeable individuals deliberately transmitted information to others. This teaching wasn't limited to immediate family members. Valuable knowledge was being shared across entire social groups, creating collective intelligence that exceeded what any individual could achieve alone. The social structures supporting this knowledge sharing were becoming increasingly sophisticated. Leadership roles were emerging based not just on physical dominance or social connections, but on expertise and knowledge. Individuals who could predict environmental changes, identify new resources, or solve technical problems gained influence that extended far beyond their immediate family groups. Specialization was beginning to appear as different individuals within groups developed expertise in different areas. Some became specialists in plant chemistry, others in animal behavior, still others in geological patterns or weather prediction. This division of knowledge allowed groups to maintain much more comprehensive understanding of their environment than would have been possible if every individual needed to master every skill. Trade relationships were expanding as groups realized that different regions offered different resources and different types of knowledge. Salt from evaporated lakes, obsidian from volcanic regions, medicinal plants from specialized chemical environments, and most importantly, information about survival techniques that worked in different conditions. These trade networks were creating connections between populations separated by hundreds of miles. The mobility required for these expanded social networks was driving further innovations in technology and social organization. Groups needed to develop portable technologies that could be carried during long-distance travel. They needed social protocols for establishing relationships with unfamiliar populations. Most importantly, they needed navigation techniques that could guide them safely across increasingly complex and dangerous landscapes. Tool technologies were becoming more sophisticated as groups encountered new materials and new challenges. The simple stone implements that had served their forest-dwelling ancestors were being replaced by composite tools that combined multiple materials for specific functions. Wooden handles increased leverage, plant fiber bindings allowed modular construction, and different types of stone were selected for different cutting tasks. But tools weren't just becoming more complex, they were becoming more standardized. Successful tool designs were being copied and refined across entire populations, creating technological traditions that could be maintained across generations. This standardization allowed knowledge about tool use and maintenance to be shared more effectively, while also enabling the development of specialized tools for specific environmental challenges. Food processing technologies were advancing rapidly as groups encountered new plant and animal resources that required different preparation techniques. Grinding stones for processing seeds, fermentation containers for preserving foods, cooking techniques that could detoxify dangerous plants or enhance nutritional value. Each innovation built on previous knowledge while adding new capabilities. The controlled use of fire was becoming central to many of these technological innovations. Fire wasn't just a source of heat and light, but a chemical processing tool that could transform inedible materials into food, dangerous substances into medicine, and raw materials into useful implements. But mastering fire required understanding combustion, heat transfer, and chemical reactions in ways that demanded increasingly sophisticated technical knowledge. Shelter construction was evolving to meet the challenges of increasingly mobile lifestyles and variable environmental conditions. The simple sleeping nests that had served arboreal ancestors were being replaced by structures that could provide protection from wind, rain, temperature extremes, and predators. These shelters needed to be constructed quickly from locally available materials while providing reliable protection in unfamiliar environments. Water procurement and treatment were becoming crucial survival skills as groups ranged across landscapes where water sources varied dramatically in availability and quality. Understanding which sources were safe, how to purify contaminated water, and how to locate reliable supplies in unfamiliar terrain required expertise that went far beyond simple thirst satisfaction. Medical knowledge was expanding as groups encountered new diseases, injuries, and environmental health hazards. Plant medicines that worked in one chemical environment might be ineffective or even dangerous in another. Understanding how to modify traditional remedies for new conditions, or how to identify entirely new medicinal resources, required sophisticated understanding of plant chemistry and human physiology. But perhaps most importantly, these early hominid populations were developing the social and cultural mechanisms needed to preserve and transmit all of this accumulated knowledge. Storytelling traditions were emerging that could encode survival information in memorable narratives. Ritual practices were developing that ensured crucial knowledge was regularly rehearsed and reinforced. Teaching methods were being refined that could effectively transfer complex technical skills from experienced individuals to novices. The pace of innovation was accelerating as larger populations and expanded social networks created more opportunities for knowledge sharing and collaborative problem solving. Innovations that might have taken thousands of years to develop through individual trial and error could now be achieved within decades through collaborative effort and systematic experimentation. Quality control mechanisms were developing to distinguish between innovations that worked and those that didn't. Groups couldn't afford to waste time and resources on ineffective technologies or dangerous practices. Social systems were emerging that could evaluate new ideas, test them safely, and either adopt or reject them based on their practical effectiveness. Risk management was becoming a sophisticated social process as groups learned to balance the benefits of innovation against the dangers of experimentation. Some innovations could be tested safely by individuals, while others required group coordination or could only be evaluated over long time periods. Understanding which risks were worth taking and how to minimize the consequences of failure became crucial survival skills. The cumulative effect of all these innovations was creating populations that were qualitatively different from anything that had existed before in the history of life. They weren't just adapted to specific environments, they were adapted to adaptation itself. They possessed the cognitive flexibility, social cooperation, and technological capabilities needed to modify their behavior faster than their environment could change. This adaptive capability was being tested constantly as the late Miocene transition continued to intensify. Environmental challenges that would have driven previous species to extinction were becoming opportunities for innovation and expansion. Each new challenge was met not with genetic adaptation that took thousands of generations, but with behavioral and technological responses that could be implemented within years or even months. The populations emerging from this crucible weren't just survivors, they were pioneers of an entirely new form of life on Earth. They had developed the basic components of what would eventually become human culture, the unique combination of intelligence, cooperation, and technological innovation that would allow their descendants to eventually dominate every ecosystem on the planet. But this transformation wasn't happening uniformly across all early hominid populations. Some groups were embracing these innovations and developing increasingly sophisticated cultural capabilities. Others were retreating to remaining stable environments where traditional forest-dwelling strategies could still work. Still others were developing intermediate adaptations that combined some innovations with traditional approaches. This divergence was creating the first great branching point in human evolutionary history. The populations that fully embraced cultural evolution were setting off on a trajectory that would eventually lead to modern humans. Those that didn't would become evolutionary dead ends, successful in the short term, but unable to adapt to the even greater environmental challenges that lay ahead. The fossil record from this period shows clear evidence of this evolutionary divergence. Some early hominid lineages show increasing brain size, more sophisticated tool use, and evidence of complex social behaviors. Others maintain more conservative anatomical features and simpler technological capabilities. The populations that were investing in cultural evolution were literally being reshaped by their innovations. Brain expansion was accelerating as the cognitive demands of cultural life selected for individuals with greater memory capacity, faster learning abilities, and more sophisticated reasoning skills. But this brain growth came at enormous metabolic cost. Larger brains required more energy, longer development periods, and more intensive parental care. Only populations with reliable food sources and strong social support systems could afford this biological investment. Social behaviors were becoming more complex as groups developed the cooperation and coordination needed to support cultural evolution. Pair bonding relationships were strengthening to provide the stable partnerships needed for intensive child rearing. Extended family networks were expanding to share the costs of supporting large-brained offspring through their lengthy development periods. Communication capabilities were advancing rapidly as the demands of cultural transmission selected for individuals who could effectively share complex information. Vocal communication was becoming more sophisticated, with expanded sound repertoires and more complex grammatical structures. Gestural communication was also evolving, providing additional channels for information transmission. The anatomical changes supporting these behavioral innovations were becoming visible in the fossil record. Changes in skull shape to accommodate larger brains, modifications to the vocal tract to support more sophisticated speech, alterations in hand anatomy to enable more precise tool manipulation. These physical changes were the biological signature of cultural evolution, but the most important changes weren't visible in fossils. They were the behavioral and social innovations that were creating entirely new ways of life. The development of traditions that could preserve knowledge across generations. The emergence of teaching methods that could effectively transmit complex skills. The creation of social institutions that could coordinate group activities across large populations. These cultural innovations were creating positive feedback loops that accelerated evolutionary change. Better tools enabled more effective resource extraction, which supported larger populations, which created more opportunities for innovation, which led to even better tools. Social cooperation enabled more ambitious projects, which required more sophisticated coordination, which selected for enhanced communication abilities, which enabled even more complex cooperation. The populations caught up in these feedback loops were experiencing evolutionary change at unprecedented rates. Within a few 100,000 years, they had developed capabilities that set them apart from every other species on Earth. They weren't just adapted to their environment, they were beginning to adapt their environment to themselves. Landscape modification was beginning as groups learned to use fire to manage vegetation, to dig channels to direct water flow, and to selectively harvest resources in ways that promoted their regeneration. These weren't the dramatic environmental modifications that would characterize later human societies, but they were the first steps toward active ecosystem management. The psychological effects of this environmental control were profound. Instead of seeing themselves as passive victims of environmental change, these early populations were beginning to understand themselves as active agents who could influence their circumstances. This shift in perspective may have been one of the crucial cognitive changes that distinguished the human lineage from other primates. Planning horizons were expanding as groups developed the ability to anticipate and prepare for future environmental changes. Instead of simply reacting to immediate challenges, they were beginning to modify their current behavior to improve their future prospects. This temporal expansion of thinking was another crucial component of human cognitive evolution. But perhaps most importantly, these populations were developing the confidence and capabilities needed to explore new environments, rather than simply adapting to existing ones. Groups that had mastered cultural evolution weren't just surviving in familiar habitats, they were actively seeking out new challenges and opportunities. This exploratory drive would eventually carry their descendants across the entire planet. As the late Miocene drew toward its close, roughly 5 million years ago, the stage was set for the next great phase of human evolution. The populations that had successfully navigated the environmental challenges of this crucial period had developed the cognitive, social, and technological toolkit needed to survive whatever challenges lay ahead. They were no longer just another species of African ape. They had become something entirely new, the first truly cultural organisms in the history of life on Earth. The climate system was preparing to deliver its ultimate test. The ice age cycles that would dominate the next several million years were beginning to develop, creating environmental challenges that would make the late Miocene transition seem mild by comparison. But the cultural pioneers emerging from this earlier crucible were ready. They had learned the most important lesson in evolutionary history, that survival didn't depend on finding the perfect environment, but on developing the ability to create the perfect response to whatever environment you found yourself in. The journey from tree-dwelling apes to spacefaring humans had begun in earnest. The environmental challenges that had seemed so overwhelming at the beginning of the late Miocene transition had become the catalyst for innovations that would eventually reshape the entire planet. The populations that had survived this crucial test weren't just carrying their genes forward into an uncertain future. They were carrying the seeds of human civilization itself. The ice was coming, and with it, a test unlike anything life on Earth had ever faced. But first, there would be one final transformation that would push the boundaries of what was possible for any living creature. As the late Miocene gave way to the Pliocene, roughly 5 million years ago, the early hominid populations scattered across Africa were about to witness the birth of something that would redefine intelligence itself. The environmental pressures that had been building for millions of years were converging into what scientists now recognize as the most intense period of evolutionary innovation in mammalian history. But this wasn't just about individual survival anymore. Something far more profound was emerging from the crucible of constant environmental challenge. The first glimmers of what we might recognize as consciousness itself. Picture an early hominid group huddled around a fire in the growing darkness of a Rift Valley evening. The flames cast dancing shadows on faces that were becoming increasingly familiar to us, with smaller brow ridges, more prominent chins, and eyes that held a spark of something that hadn't existed in their forest-dwelling ancestors. These weren't just animals responding to environmental stimuli. They were minds contemplating their own existence. The cognitive revolution that was unfolding during this period went far beyond simple problem-solving or tool use. These early populations were developing what psychologists call metacognition, the ability to think about thinking itself. They could observe their own mental processes, evaluate their own knowledge, and consciously direct their attention towards specific problems or opportunities. This self-awareness was emerging from the constant need to evaluate and modify survival strategies in unpredictable environments. Groups that could consciously assess their own knowledge, recognize gaps in their understanding, and deliberately seek out new information had enormous advantages over those operating on instinct alone. The ability to think about thinking was becoming a survival skill. Language was evolving to support these new cognitive capabilities. Simple communication about immediate needs was being replaced by complex discussions of abstract concepts, hypothetical scenarios, and causal relationships that spanned vast distances and time periods. They weren't just sharing information anymore. They were sharing ideas, beliefs, and mental models of how the world worked. The development of symbolic thinking was perhaps the most revolutionary change of all. Objects, sounds, and gestures were beginning to represent things beyond themselves. A particular arrangement of stones could represent a distant water source. A specific vocal pattern could convey information about seasonal changes. Abstract concepts like time, causation, and possibility were becoming discussable topics rather than just lived experiences. Art was beginning to appear in forms that went beyond simple decoration. Pigments were being applied to surfaces in patterns that seemed to encode information or express concepts that couldn't be communicated through language alone. These weren't just aesthetic expressions. They were external storage systems for complex ideas that exceeded the capacity of individual memory. The social implications of these cognitive advances were staggering. Groups weren't just cooperating to solve immediate survival problems anymore. They were engaging in collective reasoning, pooling their mental resources to tackle challenges that no individual could solve alone. This collective intelligence was creating problem-solving capabilities that exceeded the sum of individual contributions. Specialization was becoming more sophisticated as different individuals developed expertise in different domains of knowledge. But these specialists weren't working in isolation. They were part of integrated knowledge networks, where information flowed freely between different areas of expertise. A plant specialist might share observations that helped an animal behavior expert understand prey movements, which could inform a toolmaker's choice of materials. Teaching was evolving from simple demonstration to complex instruction that could convey not just what to do, but why it worked and how it could be modified for different circumstances. Master practitioners weren't just showing novices how to perform specific tasks. They were transmitting entire conceptual frameworks that could generate novel solutions to unforeseen problems. And so here we are, 10 million years later, the direct descendants of those chemical pioneers who refused to surrender when their forest paradise crumbled around them. Every time you solve a problem, share knowledge with a friend, or adapt to something unexpected, you're using cognitive tools forged in the volcanic crucible of the late Miocene. The climate shifts that should have erased our lineage instead created us, transforming tree-dwelling apes into the species that would eventually reach for the stars. That's the real story of human evolution, not survival of the fittest, but survival of the most adaptable. Evolution, not survival of the fittest, but survival of the most adaptable.